Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to this presentation as part of our February 1996 program, Sherman's March to the Sea. In a previous lecture, I introduced you using Nat Hughes to the Confederate commander, William Hardee. Now I want to give you a portrayal of the man of the hour, the center of so much vitriol over the years and so much controversy, and yet undoubtedly one of the most monumental men in United States military history, William T. Sherman. Sherman will go on after the war to become the commanding general of all the United States forces under Ulysses S. Grant, who becomes the president. And Sherman and Grant always had a very unique relationship. I commend that to you. If you don't know a whole lot about it, I really do commend you to spend some time with Sherman, with Sherman's papers that Brooks Simpson and his former wife, Jean Berlin, edited. Just reflect on Sherman a bit. He's a deep thinking man. At the time of the war, he was the superintendent of the new Louisiana military school that would become Louisiana State University. And this time, I believe it was in Pineville, Louisiana. And Sherman warns the South when he resigns his commission. He just says, you can't do this, you can't make war. And he said, if you do this, you will long loathe and regret this. And so Sherman clearly has a pure American streak within him. And despite all the controversy surrounding him and the vilification over the years of Sherman, he's a very interesting and intriguing figure. His post-war relations with Joe Johnston and with John Bell Hood and so forth show the human side of him. And I think on balance, all of this is good, and it's good to reflect on. You'll see a lot of opportunities, but to study Sherman, and I commend them all to you. But for now, I think of all the ones we did, this is probably one of the very few times that we actually brought out his biographer to speak to you. John Marszalek is a highly respected academic historian. I believe he has recently retired from Mississippi State University. What's really fascinating about John is in his academic career and all the time that he spent down south, when the papers of U.S. Grant were being done, which was one of the big centennial projects back in the 1960s, they had all been originated under the organizational skills of an archivist at Southern Illinois University, a man by the name of John Simon. Dr. Simon, who you will hear in another lecture here, not in this particular program, but in this series, John did a magnificent job in putting, I believe, probably more than 30 volumes of all of Grant's papers out. And I've always been grateful to John because he made it possible for me to own about 10 years of Grant's most critical time. He made it possible for me to own those papers by discounting him really, really deeply. And so I have Grant's wartime papers and his papers up through the post-war period, which has given me no end of pleasure in looking through and picking things up about that. But John Marszalek was such good friends that when a turf battle ensued in Southern Illinois about the placement in the space that was being allocated to the Grant papers, Simon, who was what was the term they used, who was a resident on the campus, but was certainly a guest using Southern Illinois papers and office space. When they wanted to change things around, John said no. He liked them just the way they had been for 30 some odd, 40 years. And Southern Illinois said, nope, it doesn't work. John says, fine, I'll take this away from you. They said, bye, good riddance. And lo and behold, the Grant Papers office had to look for a new home. John resigned, and John Marszalek, his good friend, agreed to bring the archives of U.S. Grant from Illinois to Starkville, Mississippi, where they sit today in the Mississippi State University Library. Interesting, a place founded by President Stephen D. Lee, now with a Yankee professor who specialized in Sherman, now is the executive director of the U.S. Grant Papers Project. So long ways to go, and a long ways that John has come with this. Delightful gentleman, soft-spoken, had the opportunity, and when he came in, to pick him up at the Savannah airport and then sit and wait for his flight to go out. And we had a lot of nice talks as a result of this. And I consider John to be one of the real gentlemen in the business. And I think you'll enjoy his presentation on William Tecumseh Sherman, A Soldier's Passion for Order, which is the name of the book he wrote.
William L. Giles, Distinguished Professor in 1994. Is a specialist in the U.S. Civil War, the Jacksonian period, and race relations. He's the author or editor of 8 books and over 150 articles and book reviews. He has lectured widely and has appeared on ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC television, the Arts and Entertainment Television Network, Mississippi Educational Television, and radio stations throughout the nation. He teaches freshman survey classes, undergraduate and graduate courses in American history, and has produced 20 master's and doctoral students. He's best known for his award-winning book, Sherman, A Soldier's Passion for Order, written in 1993, and a 1972 book called Court Martial, which was made into a Showtime motion picture and reissued as a paperback, both under the new title Assault at West Point, issued in 1994. In 1995, President Clinton presented the subject of this book with a posthumous U.S. Army commission. Dr. Marszalek co-edited with Charles Lowry the Encyclopedia of African American Civil Rights from Emancipation to Present, named by the Library Journal as one of the best referenced books published in 1982. In 1994, Louisiana State University Press reissued in paperback his Diary of Miss Emma Holmes, 1861 to 1866. His publications have been the subject of major news stories and newspapers all over the nation, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and USA Today. Dr. Marszalek is a U.S. Army Vietnam veteran and is married to the former Jeannie Cosmer. They are the parents of 3 young children. Please join me in welcoming John Marszalek.
Thank you very much. Let me put in a commercial, too, about the movie Assault at West Point. I don't know if I'm going to need this. I speak pretty loudly, so if I'm not loud enough. But anyway, this movie, my wife and I were in it. We were extras in this movie. And Showtime is going to be re-showing it again this Sunday evening. I think it's at 7 o'clock. But it is also available from your various video stores. If you don't blink, you will see us in the last scene where the Army lawyer is making this really racist comment about Johnson Whitaker, and over his shoulder you can see my wife and me and the granddaughter of this black cadet. It's a wonderful movie, I think, and it was a real thrill to go to the White House this summer and have President Clinton, on behalf of the nation, give this man his posthumous commission, which was taken from him over what happened. But anyway, everybody's doing commercials here, so I thought I would. I'm making no money on this movie, so it's not that at all. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about Sherman and the March to the Sea. It all began, as you know, and Ed Bars, I'm sure, gave you all this information yesterday as you went through this bus trip, which I'm sorry I had to miss. But Sherman and his 62,000 man army left Atlanta, and like Xenophon of classical fame, struck out for the sea. Sherman, as you know, cut himself off from his supply lines, and for most contact with the outside world. His brother John Sherman didn't know where he was. Even Abraham Lincoln didn't know where he was or where he was going. 6 weeks or so later, with a suddenness that added to the drama, Sherman and his men reappeared on the ocean, back in contact with the Union fleet and the outside world. Sherman then telegraphed Abraham Lincoln and stirred the national imagination when he offered President Lincoln and the nation Savannah as a Christmas gift. And this again stirred the Union imagination. Sherman was not just Xenophon, northern newspapers exclaimed. He had not just reached the sea, as that Athenian of classical fame had. Sherman was also Santa Claus. He was Santa Claus. Well, Sherman and his men had accomplished a military feat that, as we know, helped break the back of the Confederate war effort. It cemented his place in history as one of the major figures of the Union victory. And of course, it also made him the great villain of the later lost cause. Sherman, as you all know, became the primary symbol of the Southern contention that the Union military effort was brutish, whereas the Confederate war effort was virtuous and pure. Just compare the leaders on the two sides, the argument went. Robert E. Lee was saintly, some even going so far as to say that he was a Christ-like figure. William T. Sherman, in contrast, was the devil incarnate. Lee was valiant in defeat. Sherman was brutal in victory. Never before or never since, the story went, was there a military figure as vicious and as cruel as this Union general. To this day, I would argue, this vision of a brutal Sherman and his heartless march to the sea looms large in pro-Confederate thinking, and I would argue in Sherman's place in American history. Now, I would argue that this view of Sherman the Brute is based less on the facts of his activities and more on the psychological impact these activities caused. Now, I think, it's conventional historical wisdom, I'm sure you've heard it all before, that Sherman waged psychological warfare against the Confederacy. He did. He attempted to convince the South that if it did not stop this war would get increasingly terrible for the South. And the interesting thing about all of this is, as Sherman's army marches through the South, through Georgia and of course through the Carolinas, Southerners help spread the message that Sherman wants to be spread. Southerners spread the rumors of the horror that awaited those in his path. Therefore, Sherman grows bigger and bigger in the Southern imagination. He's the boogeyman that's used to frighten little kids. If you're not good, I'm going to take you to General Sherman. And this was done not just during the war, but long after the war. I've heard people tell me this story. He's the villain that Confederate soldiers are told represents the Union side that had to be defeated if Southern wives and daughters were to be protected. Sherman seemed to be marching everywhere, all at the same time. Or so the rumors had it, anyway. And I would argue that this anticipatory anxiety, I don't know if there are any psychologists in the room, and last time I gave a presentation, there was a retired clinical psychologist in the audience, and thankfully, he said what I said made some sense. It's always embarrassing when somebody stands up and says, your whole talk was gibberish. But anyway, this anticipatory anxiety about Sherman's coming grew increasingly greater and greater. The tales of his alleged terrible feats grew more and more graphic. Slaveholders, for example, told their slaves that in Atlanta, Sherman's soldiers had locked slaves, had locked black people in buildings before they torched them. Women were told to expect unspeakable violations at the hands of Sherman soldiers. So I would argue that rumor became reality in many Georgia minds. And I would argue, and this maybe is even more important, rumor became reality in the minds of Southerners far from the path of the actual march. So once the war is over, the lost cause mythology builds on this contemporary perspective, eventually blaming Sherman for destruction he never did in areas where he and his army never even visited. You cannot imagine how many people have come up to me since Sherman, that people know that I've done something on Sherman, and have told me, well, Sherman destroyed my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's farm. And we'll get into a conversation, well, where did he live? And Sherman's army was not within 100 miles of where I shouldn't say, did anybody here from North Carolina? Okay, well, I'm going to be in Fayetteville at a conference later on, but I have some friends who are associated with Bentonville, in the big debate over Bentonville. But in any case, apparently, and don't quote me on this, but apparently I'm told that the Secretary of Culture, or whatever it's called in North Carolina, is really up in arms about having any monuments to Union soldiers at Bentonville, because she says Sherman's soldiers destroyed her great-great-great-great-grandfather. They camped right there and did all these horrible things. Well, some of the Civil War people in that area looked up her great-great-grandfather's farm. Sherman's army was never near it. But that doesn't matter. That is the kind of the image. Favorite story of mine, too, a friend of mine who came from Alabama said he attended a pilgrimage. As you know, in the South, we do a lot of pilgrimages. Wonderful things. Columbus, Mississippi. Come to our pilgrimage in Columbus, Mississippi, 20 miles. This is just filled with commercials today. But anyway, one of these annual pilgrimages in the early 1980s, and he said he heard one of the ladies wearing a hoop skirt, just a guide just taking people around. She was standing in the middle of the street with antebellum houses on either side of her. And she proceeded very solemnly to tell how Sherman's army had marched through this town and literally burned it to the ground. Now, all these antebellum houses are on either side of it. Now, Sherman was never there, and obviously, since the houses are still standing, something's wrong. But anyway, where does this inaccurate perception come from then? What does it mean? Well, among other things, I think it means that Sherman's psychological warfare was very successful. One might argue, too successful. Not only did he disturb the Confederate mind in 1864 and 1865, but his forced entry then into the Southern mind was so traumatic that in many people he remains a disturbance to this very day. What makes this fact so intriguing, I think, is that immediately after the war, before the organized lost cause effort began its historiographical efforts in Virginia in the late 19th century, Southerners as a group did not consider Sherman a brute. He continued, for example, to have Southern friends, as he had since he first came to the South in 1840 as a young soldier. Friendly notices of Sherman appeared in Southern newspapers in the post-war period. In 1868, there was the first of many booms for Sherman to run for the presidency. You know where it began in 1868? The first time it happened, it began in the South because of a speech he made in New Orleans. People said, hey, this is the guy we want to be president. In 1879, he retraced his steps his war studies, visiting places, areas where he had fought and where he had marched. His reception was cordial. I would say basically a festive mood greeted him as he visited places like Atlanta, Savannah, and in my home state, Jackson, Mississippi. And again, since we are here in the home of the Georgia Historical Quarterly, I wrote a little article about Sherman's 1879 visit that appears in an earlier issue of the Georgia Historical Quarterly. Now, sometime down the road, I'm planning to do a book on the Sherman image in the American mind, the development of all this, because the whole thing's intriguing. And maybe this is a result of me, very short Polish kid from Buffalo, New York, teaching for 20 years in Mississippi. So I look at things from multiple. But anyway, so I'm going to, I'm not going to muse about that any further. Today I want to talk more directly about the march and more about Sherman's inspiration and his motivation in making it. I think you have to keep in mind, though, that you cannot separate the march from the American perception of it. The mythic qualities of this march are just too great to ever separate fact from fancy completely. What are some of the facts of the matter? Not the myth, but some of the facts of the matter. I think one of the major facts are that Sherman's army did a tremendous amount of destruction, a tremendous amount of damage on Southern property during the march to the sea. There's no debate about that, no disagreement over that. Sherman never debated that, never disagreed about it, never flinched from taking responsibility for the destruction he and his army wrought. It's important to remember, however, that Sherman's march, and I'm not going to get into the Carolina thing, Ed Barrs is going to talk to you about that, I guess it's tomorrow, or is it tonight? I think it's tonight. In any case, I'm going to concentrate really on the march to the sea, although some of the same things that are said here could be said there. But anyway, it's important to note that Sherman did not, and his army did not implement a scorched earth policy. There was not a 20-mile or 40-mile or 60-mile, whatever mile wide slash through Georgia where everything in the path of the army was just absolutely leveled. It simply didn't happen. You can read Lee Kennett's book. Lee's going to talk to you right after I'm finished. Mark Grimsley, who's going to be talking to you, I guess that is tomorrow, talking to us tomorrow in his latest book, gets into all of this. In reading those two books and in my own research, I'm pretty convinced. I think they demonstrate this fact in different ways. But there's also an earlier study which I find really interesting, and I cite in the footnote of my book. This is a study done in 1955 by a geographer, of all things. He studied not the entire march to the sea, but he studied the area between Covington and Milledgeville in here. And again, he found that there were 72 houses that had been built in that area before the march took place. So these are pre-Sherman's March to the Sea houses we're talking about. He found that in 1955, 22 of those houses, of those 72 houses, were still standing. 9 of those houses were no longer there, but they had been torn down after the Civil War. 11 building sites he could not discover, and 27 of the other discoverable sites, he said, the disposition of the houses was unclear. Now again, he published that in 1957 in the Georgia Historical Quarterly, published here in this building. He concluded that, quote, a great many houses, perhaps even most of them, escaped destruction during the march to the sea. So that is the most, factual study that I've come across, and there may be others. I think what we can say then, based on this geographer study and based on the memoirs, the diaries, and other things from this period, I think it's clear that Sherman's army was selective in its destruction. Please don't get the idea I'm saying that there wasn't any destruction. There was a lot of it, but the destruction was selective. the guiding principle for the soldiers seemed to be that any physical property that had anything to do with the supply and support of the Confederate Army, the war effort, anything that had anything to do with slavery, anything that had anything to do with prisoners of war, any of these things was put to the torch or the sledgehammer. In addition, fence rails were routinely taken to make cooking fires and heating fires. We know it does get cold in Georgia. Farm animals, farm produce was regularly taken, and they ate it. It was wonderful to find a pig and cook the pig. I mean, it was just, terrific. Dogs were routinely killed, no matter their age or their size, because Union soldiers were convinced that Southerners used all kinds of dogs to track down runaway slaves and fugitive prisoners of war. Andersonville, after all, is not that far. Stocks or whipping posts or anything else used to punish or torment the slaves was routinely destroyed. Now, what about the houses themselves? Well, houses along the route might or might not be entered. If occupants of a house left it, chances are that house would be entered and pillaged. Whereas an occupied house might or might not be entered and might or might not be pillaged. Barns, outhouses, slave cabins received a wide variety of treatments too, as did shops and business areas in town. A building might be thoroughly ransacked in the path of Sherman's army, and then it might be destroyed, or it might be ignored entirely, or it might even be protected by a specific by an armed Union soldier, because somebody knew somebody or whatever it might be. People always ask me, and I'll maybe handle this now, I don't want to take anybody's question away, but people always ask two questions. Did Sherman save houses because A, somebody put a Masonic symbol on them, or did Sherman, that's interesting, but I like the second one better, did Sherman save houses because a former girlfriend lived there? Well, first of all, Sherman was not a Mason. His father was a major Mason in Ohio, but his father died when he was 9 years old. I don't know of any instances of this. Maybe Lee will want to talk about that some. If the stories that I've heard about Sherman saving houses of former girlfriends are all true, Sherman was a very busy man. I mean, this guy must have had girlfriends. I know that there's a recent book that makes a big fuss about Sherman and allegedly having some affairs later on in life, but that's another story. But I don't see, I haven't come across any, but there are some instances where he did know people. No question about this. He did know people because he had been through this area as a young lieutenant. But I don't know of any policy particularly. But in any case, so a building might undergo all kinds of possible treatment. Might be left alone, might be destroyed, might be ransacked, might not be ransacked. You just didn't know. And it was this kind of uncertainty, in fact, in many ways, that made the anxiety of people in the march that much worse. There seemed to be such little rhyme or reason to it all. And this makes it a lot more frightening. We need certainty in our lives. And we want to know that we know what is going to happen. And when we're not sure what's going to happen, when we hear about somebody being hurt by a mugger, have you ever noticed this? What we want to know is we want to find and somehow convince ourselves that that person did something stupid. That's the only reason he got attacked. Now, I'm not going to do anything stupid, therefore I will not be attacked. Well, it's a similar situation here. There's just no way of knowing. No way of knowing. Well, even worse, as far as Georgians were concerned, they had to face not only Sherman's destruction, but destruction caused by a bunch of other groups of people. There was the main Union columns that Ed, I'm sure, I'm sorry I missed that yesterday, but I was enjoying what he had to say. And seeing the places. But in addition to the main Union columns, as you know, there were organized foragers that were thrown out in all directions. There was a screening Union cavalry that went out in all directions, as we know. But there were also, all these groups did various kinds of destruction. But in addition to this, Georgians also faced destruction from temporary and permanent Union deserters, sometimes called the bummers, although after the war, the bummers got to be kind of a name that many soldiers took on as a badge of honor. But there were bummers. Fugitive slaves did destruction. Confederate deserters did destruction. Unscrupulous Southern civilians were involved in destruction. And of course, Confederate General Joe Wheeler's cavalry, as Matt was talking to us about. And this pillaging of Wheeler's men was particularly a source of anguish for Southern civilians. It was bad enough when Sherman's soldiers destroyed. It was heartbreaking when Southern boys did it to their own people. Yet, even Georgia civilians were not blameless themselves. Union soldiers were surprised to find how often Georgia women seemed willing to accept this destruction if others suffered. One of the most interesting quotes is, one woman said to some Sherman soldiers, "Well, I don't care if you only serve South Carolina the same way, for they got us into this scrape. As long as you send it to those Carolinians, it's going to be all right." We sometimes forget that this is one great big loving family, the Confederacy, or the Union for that matter. So the point I'm getting at, not maybe beating it to the ground, there's a lot of destruction. If you go back and somebody asks you, what'd you learn from being in Savannah, going to that symposium, you say, well, I learned that Sherman did a lot of destruction. You say, gee, you didn't get your money's worth. But anyway, so there's a lot of destruction. But I think what historians are coming to believe, the position historians are coming to, and I think was best expressed in a 1991 issue of Civil War History by Mark Neely, namely that the Civil War was not really total war, that Sherman did not really practice total war. Charles Royster, in his book, calls it destructive war. Mark Grimsley, in his book, calls it hard war. The point being that the meaning of total war as we understand it, total war was really not practiced. And again, you can debate that up one side, down the other. But in any case, I think it's fair to say, however, whatever side you take on this, that Sherman did take war to Southern civilians in a manner that was, first of all, not unique for the Civil War. There's a movement, I think Grimsley puts it quite well, from a war of conciliation to a hard war. So there is a movement that direction on the Union side generally. Royster points out some of the things that Stonewall Jackson had to say that he would have liked to have done. So there is a movement, obviously, away from quote-unquote gentlemanly war. But what Sherman does is not unique for the Civil War, and it's certainly not unique if you compare that to other wars in the history of humankind. But in the force of sheer drama, psychological impact at that time and since, I think we would pretty much agree that the March to the Sea in the Carolinas was really the cataclysmic event of the Civil War. Well, how did Sherman arrive then at this decision to march the sea? I think this is a very important question because it gives us an insight both into Sherman's motivation and the kind of war that he did fight. Now we know what the lost cause answer is. Why did Sherman do this? Sherman fought the war that he did because basically he was a rotten guy. I mean, it's a simple answer. It's simple. There's a recent book that says, you understand Sherman, you have to understand the guy is just filled with rage. He's just mad at everybody. Mad at the world, mad at his wife, mad at, you name it, he's mad at. No other reason except that Sherman's a rotten guy. And then what he does, he's in his anger and in the fact that he's basically a rotten guy, he wreaks all this vicious, unnecessary, destructive havoc against a helpless people. Now, Sherman had a temper. Most of us have a temper. My wife tells me I have a temper. I can't believe that. I mean, I don't know where she gets that from. Stories she tells. So, you know, that's not an unusual thing to say. But to say that Sherman hated Southerners, I think, is not really provable. In fact, all the evidence goes in the other direction, that Sherman had an affection for the South and its people. All the evidence, as I read it anyway, points not to a compulsion to punish Southerners, but really Sherman's desire to save them from the ultimate punishment, death. You know, like so many other generals and politicians, and like the common soldier, which Joseph Glathar, in his book on Sherman's March to the Sea, has pointed out. People had concluded, and Sherman, I think, is at the forefront of this, that the South is not going to give up this war easily. I thought Nat's point about what Hardee had to say was so very interesting. And yet the war goes on. We don't have a chance here, Hardee says, but we're going to keep fighting. That the South is not going to give up easily, and that the harsh measures were going to be necessary to force the South to stop, to quit. There's a lot more to this decision, and I want to just, and you've got it in your outline there, and I'm going to try to follow it. I hope I don't get off on too many tangents here. But in any case, too often we forget, and again, I was glad to see it already mentioned this morning, that Sherman's decision to march out, to move out across Georgia, was a result of the condition he found himself after the Atlanta campaign. There he is. He and his army are sitting there in the middle of Georgia, in hostile country, supplied over this narrow railroad line, you know, going back to Chattanooga, and further back to Nashville, then further into the south, and then finally into the north. Sherman feels very frustrated throughout the Atlanta campaign. He's making steady progress, as we know, against Joe Johnston. But as he captures territory, he has to drop off soldiers, drop off units of sentinels to protect the railroad that he's capturing. You know, he's moving along this railroad, basically. The more successful he becomes, the smaller his advancing army becomes, because the more land he takes, the more people he's got to drop off to protect the railroad from Confederate assaults. Conversely, the more territory Joe Johnston loses, the bigger his army becomes, because he's able to take in his sentinels. So Sherman begins to worry, if I keep winning like this all the time, I'm going to get beaten. I'm going to lose. Now, even after he captures Atlanta, or perhaps when he captures Atlanta, he still has this problem. The problem's even bigger. He's got the whole railroad now, all the way to Atlanta. And yes, he does worry about Nathan Bedford Forrest. But I would argue that Forrest is so busy beating Union troops being sent from Memphis and other places against him that Sherman sends out, that I think he never really poses a significant threat to Sherman's supply line. Sherman tends to exaggerate a lot. And, Bedford Forrest might do it, but in actual fact, he doesn't. Sherman's not really worried about cavalry units. He can flip them. He doesn't think much of cavalry anyway, so he can flip them off. But when John Bell Hood starts maneuvering his main army to take and try to capture the line, Sherman's worried. He's got to react in force, and he's terribly frustrated to find himself fighting over the same places he had captured. He's going back to square one. In fact, one of his soldiers says, "Hey, you notice that place? That's where we started from." Well, he's able to keep the hood off his railroad, but he realizes that he's got a problem. He's got to supply his army. He's not going to supply his army through conventional thinking. So I would argue to protect his army, to ensure his Atlanta campaign victory, he destroys his supply line. He gets rid of it. And what he has to do then, he decides he has to change his base of operations, as he calls it, by marching from Atlanta to the Atlantic coast, living off the land as he marches. And all he did, he argued in an 1880s magazine article that he wrote for Century Magazine. It was in North America, I can't remember. But anyway, he wrote, generals are writing all these articles telling you what really happened afterwards, usually telling you how great they were and what was happening. But anyway, the Battles and Leaders series comes out of that. But anyway, what Sherman says, he analyzes his campaign. And he says, all I'm doing is I'm changing my base of operations. All I'm doing is positioning my army so it's ready to join Grant against Lee in Virginia. My eye is on the ball. The ball is in Virginia. And he said, well, yeah, I lived off the land, but all kinds of other armies in the past lived off the land too. Sherman saw this as fairly routine. Of course, it wasn't. It's hardly a traditional troop movement. It was so revolutionary that both Lincoln and Grant were frightened that it was going to prove to be a disaster and expressed serious reservations about it. After all, look what Sherman's doing. He's literally turning his back on a major Confederate army under Hood, leaving only a part of his force under George H. Thomas to deal with that Army of Tennessee. He takes the best men, literally leaves Howard what's left, takes the best men, conducts an extended raid out of contact with his government, out of contact with any other army. Now, he'd masterminded such activity earlier in the war when he conducted his February 1864 Meridian campaign in Mississippi. And I'm sure you're familiar that Ed's better half has written the book on the Meridian campaign. You don't know anything about that, you go there. And people have said that they always knew that the brains in the Barris family was... But I wouldn't say that. I certainly wouldn't say that. But if you want to know about the Meridian campaign, don't look to Ed Bars, look to his wife. That he did. That raid was very successful, the Meridian campaign, and it was kind of the blueprint. If you look at the Meridian campaign, you look the way Sherman organized the March to the Sea, there are great similarities. Now, Sherman had also seen examples of this kind of warfare earlier in his life. As a young lieutenant, he had been involved in the war against the Seminole Indians in the early 1840s in Florida. And as a young Army officer, he watched with, at first, disgust, and eventually with grudging admiration, as the Seminole Indians battled the Army of the United States. They battled it not just with their braves, but with their entire society. And the U.S. Army in Florida, and they really didn't learn the lesson very well. In some ways, the Seminole War was a good place to lose your reputation as an Army officer, because you'd go there and you'd mess up, and that'd be the end of it. But anyway, the Army came to realize that if it was to have any hope in Florida to defeat the Seminole Indians, it could not simply battle the braves. It simply could not battle the fighting force of the Seminole Indians. It had to bring the war home to the entire Seminole nation, because the entire society, Seminole society, was battling against the Army. So, in order to win the Seminole War, the U.S. Army learned that they had to attack the home front. They had to get to the entire society. One could argue, I think, that this is a lesson that Sherman tucked away for 1864 reference. At West Point, even before he went to Florida, while he was a cadet, he had taken a class in ethics, as all the cadets had to. In that ethics class, he read some books, and in those books, it was pointed out that in time of war, morality changed. And in order to win the war, you could have society battling against society, not just army against army. Now, a West Point chaplain of recent time, and I have to apologize, one of those last things I was going to check, and I forgot, but it is in the book. Brimsfield, I think his name. Anybody remember? He wrote a book. He wrote an article, actually, in Parameters, the very good journal of military history, in which he talks about this question of Sherman developing some of his attitudes in an early class. I wouldn't push it too far, but it's a possibility. It's possible. It's possible that in 1864, when he was viewing the problem of how to face this problem of winning the war, that he might have recalled in the back of his head some of those lessons he had learned at West Point. I think more importantly, all his life, Sherman had been involved in what the military calls logistics. Logistics. He'd been, after all, an Army supply officer all around the nation. As a civilian, in California and in New York, he had been a banker and kind of an entrepreneur. In Kansas, he had been a lawyer and a real estate manager, for want of a better way of putting it. In Louisiana, he was a school administrator. He was superintendent of the Louisiana Military Seminary. Today's Louisiana State University, LSU, which is one of our big rivals at Mississippi State. And I always tell the students, if you really want to put it to those LSU people, just tell them that Sherman was their first president. And that was right. They may win the game, but anyway, all these experiences, he came, I think he came to see firsthand that society, whether Army society or civilian society, depended for survival, and does depend on survival, on efficient supply systems. You break the flow of supplies to a society, and that society is going to wither away. Just look at what was going on in Bosnia in recent years. I often think about it. I'm driving along the highway, and these big trucks are passing me, and you get infuriated, at what's going on. And you have to stop and think. Those trucks don't keep rolling. I don't keep eating, so I can take a little hassle on the highway. But again, supply is the essential thing for an army. It's the essential thing for any society. So if a society has good supply, has good logistics, it is going to be all right. If it doesn't, it's not going to be successful. Sherman marveled when he was in California at a sight he frequently saw there. Migrants arriving after a long journey across the continent. From the Midwest, usually St. Joseph, Missouri, they would begin to go across this continent. How do they survive? They survived by subsisting off the land. They had a supply system. It wasn't a long supply line back. They lived off the land. And Sherman often said, he said, I got thinking about this. He said, if such people, men, women, and children, could make it across the continent, why couldn't my well-organized army make it across Georgia and subsist off the land? Now, understand, too, that Sherman's viewpoint on warfare first began to change early in the war, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, but in Kentucky and in Memphis in 1861, 1862, here he faced hostile guerrillas, irregulars whom Confederate society nurtured, ambushed Union armies and their supporters. But this was not traditional warfare as he saw it, and it convinced him that the South was no longer fighting a conventional war. They're using guerrillas. Gentlemen don't do these kinds of things. They're doing it. It's fighting the war with its entire society, he comes to believe. He believes that the South could change warfare by using guerrillas. So, he argued, Union officers, Union leaders, better change their attitude, and they better start thinking about a different way to fight this war. He grew convinced, I believe, in Memphis particularly, that the Union would never win the war by merely defeating the Confederate Army. It could only win the war if it defeated the entire society. He said, I had no problem with the army, Confederate Army in Memphis. It was those guerrillas that were the problem. It was those civilians that were the problem. So Sherman, I think, came to see that he was going to have to battle the home front if the Union Army is going to win this war. In several important ways, too, I would argue that Sherman's determination to march to the sea was the result of a lifetime of failure. All his life, he suffered one reverse after another, beginning with his father's death when he was 9 years old, leading right straight through his voluntary withdrawal from Louisiana when secession came in 1861. No matter what Sherman tried, he seemed to fail. All his life, therefore, he was constantly trying new things. Got to come up with something to make it, to find success. Therefore, I would argue, in warfare, change and experimentation is not foreign to him. It's part of his being. So, faced with the problem, just another problem in his life, how are we going to defeat the Confederacy? He's willing to try something new, disruptive war. Important to his thinking, too, I would argue, was the fact that he knew this Southern society he was battling so well. You know, he'd been born in Ohio, in Lancaster, Ohio. I was talking to Paulette, who comes from Columbus. We were just discussing that during the break. But when he's 16 years old, he goes to West Point. In many ways, and I'm not telling you anything new, West Point was a Southern institution. An institution of Southern culture, though it was in Hudson River in New York. Following graduation, as a young lieutenant, almost all of his Army duty assignments are in the South. Various places in Florida during the Seminole War and after, Fort Morgan near Mobile, Alabama. If you've never been to Fort Morgan, it's a very interesting place because it has all Civil War. It's a Civil War fort, but it's also a Spanish-American War, and later stuff is there too. I didn't put that quite well, but anyway, Fort Moultrie. 4 years he spends at Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor. St. Louis, New Orleans, and of course, as we know, in the late 1850s in Louisiana. Now, in all these places, he comes to know and admire Southerners. He shares Southern attitudes on slavery, on black participation in society. He comes to understand Southern pride and Southern determination. He makes so many friends in the South. In fact, in Louisiana, he's asked to join the Confederate Army. That'd be interesting, Sherman in the Confederate Army. But he literally broke down and cried when he had to leave Louisiana. When he had to leave behind these friends. You know, we often talk about Lee's big decision. Sherman had a big decision to make, too. First time he's made a success in his life, and what happens? He's got to leave. He's got to leave his friends. He comes early in the war, particularly in Kentucky, and then at Shiloh, he comes face to face with some of these friends on the battlefield. He comes to see that he indeed is fighting friends. This is just not a generic friend. These are people he really knows. He runs into them. He's as prisoners of war, etc. He knows their determination. He talks to them. They are very determined, and he's worried that the Union doesn't have a similar resolve. He becomes very depressed in Kentucky. All kinds of stuff been written about this depression. But the one thing is pretty clear. A major reason for his depression is because he's upset at having to fight Southerners, having to fight his friends. I think that's a major precipitating factor in his depression. Now, I think all of these matters enter into Sherman's ruminations over how to fight and win the war. He believes with all his heart the Union has to be preserved. To do this, he knows the South has to be defeated. But he also knows the South is going to battle on stubbornly to the very end. The thought of killing friends to achieve the victory that he saw necessary for the survival of the Union and for his own survival was too harsh for him to contemplate. Therefore, he has to march to the sea. There's no other acceptable way. He will destroy Southern property. He will destroy the Southern will to keep fighting. But in the process, he's going to preserve the lives of Southerners, the lives of his friends. Keep in mind, he lets it be known, as long as the South keeps fighting, he's going to keep destroying. Once the South quits, however, and he likes to say this very often, I will continue to be the South's best friend. True to his word, when he came here to Savannah, he tolerated no destruction in the city. There's no pillaging here. He even allowed William Hardee's forces to slip away rather than facing them in this crucial battle. His people kept saying, why are you leaving this road open? He doesn't want to fight and kill. My friend Albert Castell criticizes Sherman in the Atlanta campaign. Says the problem with Sherman is have a killer's instinct. I don't know why. I think I do. I think he does not want to battle. He does not want to kill. Later, when Joe Johnston surrenders his troops to Sherman at Durham Station, Sherman gives him such mild terms that his own government suspects him of treason. William T. Sherman. Treason. A traitor. When his army, and we don't often remember this, but his army's got to get from Durham Station to Washington, D.C. for the May 1865 Grand Review. So they march through Carolina, through Virginia. There is no pillaging during that time. No violence against Southern property to speak of. Sherman destroyed in Georgia and later in the Carolinas for a purpose, to end the war as quickly as possible. As soon as he achieves that end, the destruction stops. So I would argue the march to the sea is not an exercise in wanton pillaging. It's a calculated effort to save lives, to win the war as quickly and as bloodlessly as possible. Now later on, we're all familiar with the statement that Sherman made, well, he kind of made it. War is hell. He didn't quite put it that succinctly, but in any case, war is hell. I think he put it more graphically, however, in Atlanta, to the mayor and the town council when he said, quote, war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. I think one could make the argument that the march to the sea, he does try to refine it by substituting destruction for killing as a way to accomplish the victory. Now, he achieves his goals, but he's paid the price ever since. Great irony in this war, that Civil War generals who led men to their deaths in battle are revered. The general who destroyed property instead of killing people is reviled. I think the reason for this phenomenon is unfortunately clear. There is perceived glory in participating or even dying in battle, even in a losing battle. There's no glory in having one's barn burned. What does Sherman think of all of this? Well, I thought of all kinds of quotes that I could end with. I am ending this interminable speech, but anyway. But I decided instead to quote from a novel. Cynthia Bass has written a novel called Sherman's March. Very nice, a very nice book. I better say that I gave it a blurb. You know, one of those little things says it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Anyway, it's a good book. But anyway, she puts these words into Sherman's mouth, and let me end with these words. This is supposedly Sherman speaking. Now she made this up. So ends the march. So begins history. Sherman speaking. The South clearly will never forgive me. The North appears likely never to understand. No side will comprehend I was a peacemaker. Those who revere and those who abhor me revere and abhor for the same illusion. I have become not a general in a particular war, but eternal. The eternal destroyer in an ageless, eternal war. And I think that's a good description of Sherman. He is indeed the eternal destroyer. His name will always be associated with this in an ageless, eternal war, which I believe the American Civil War will always be. Thank you very much.
Have some questions, please?
Yes, sir.
Were there any occupation troops left in Atlanta, or did everybody pull out?
Well, you remember what Sherman did? One of the lessons that bothered him from this campaign against Joe Johnston is always having to leave people behind and guard places. So what he did is he moved people out of Atlanta. So Atlanta is no longer a city, it's a military post. Now keep in mind that there weren't many people left in Atlanta by the time it was captured, so we're not talking about a whole lot of people, maybe 1,000, 1,200 people. But this resulted in the great exchange of letters between Sherman and Hood, where Hood calls Sherman all kinds of names. This is barbaric, making these people leave, etc., etc., etc. And this is when Sherman responds, in war is cruelty, you cannot refine it. So he doesn't really leave any troops behind. The interesting thing is, there is a letter, at least one and more than that, letters from Confederate officers thanking Sherman for the way he treated the people that left Atlanta. And I think one of the most interesting letters that I came across, and I suppose I should have mentioned it, is a letter from several Confederate officers whose families live in Savannah. Sherman has completed the march to the sea. He gets a letter from these people that he knew before saying, please take care of my family. You, the great brute, I'm putting my family in your control. So anyway, that's a roundabout way of saying, but no, he doesn't leave troops.
A question, the famous forage liberally order, what in effect did he tell his subordinate commanders that they could do? What were his ground rules for destruction? How much did he know and how much did he just not want to know? In other words, how relevant was his mind toward what was actually happening out there?
Good, very good question. Yeah, the famous order. I mean, the order says, you know, you will forage liberally off the land. This is the order that goes out to his army. Several things. The army knows very little about what's going on. He says, look, we're going to leave this place, we're going to go someplace else, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to go, and besides, it's none of your business to know. I'm the general, and your officers will take care of you, just do it. And the point was, as Nat pointed out, these soldiers loved Sherman. They accepted, that's fine. Old Uncle Billy says that, that's great. Now, what did he really mean? If you read that letter, read that order, pardon me, it's pretty clear that he's saying there should be organized foraging. It should be done under control of officers. It should be put into a very organized setting, etc. It never happened that way. Sherman knew it wasn't going to happen. I think knew it wasn't going to happen that way, and really did not attempt to impose a lot of that kind of discipline. Joe Johnston said to Sherman after the war, he said, you have one of the most disciplined armies in the world. Sherman said, what do you mean? He said, well, you'd send these guys out in all different directions, and they'd always come back. You can't say most armies, they'd be gone. But Sherman, I think, Sherman's purpose, my reading of it is, he knew very well what was going on. He knew about the destruction. The guy wasn't stupid. He does not hold back on it. I think the thing that's most intriguing about it, however, is, and I think that if there had been a lot of physical assaults, he would have stepped in. But there's very little evidence of physical. Joe Glattheart, in his book, March to the Sea, does some very sophisticated stuff with medical records and all the rest, dealing with the question of rape. And there just wasn't much rape going on. And there's a lot of reasons for that, too, 19th century attitudes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, to answer your question, Sherman set some rules and regulations, I think knowing they're going to be ignored. But the point is, that this kind of terror that is put out there is precisely what he hopes is going to happen.
Just to build on, and I think you first opened the light first time I read your book and said on the deaths of soldiers. I think builds up that because of our antecedents we have, and our friend up in North Carolina underlines it, that people remember property being destroyed,
Yeah.
because that's more important to them, property. And whether property was very valuable, then it becomes increasingly valuable, and they would have inherited, but everybody has to die. And they forget about the person who has been killed, because he's all gone in one generation. But property carries from generation to generation.
That's very,
Just building, you were the father of that thought, when I first heard you read your book.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
When he expelled the people from Atlanta, you said that he had letters that thanked him for the way he did it?
Yeah.
What is it that he did that they thanked him for?
Oh, the kindness with which the people were put on the wagons and the way the soldiers took care of them and took them wherever they were being taken to. That the people who were moved were handled very pleasantly. Now, does not say that these people thought that Atlanta should have been, made into a military force. Of course not. I thought the comment made about where is Sherman when Atlanta needs her most, I thought was a very interesting thing. Keep in mind that Atlanta came back very quickly. The Gone with, I didn't want to get into this, but the Gone with the Wind image of Atlanta burning to the ground, etc., of course, is not accurate, but I think that has something to do in contemporary minds. When we think of Sherman, we think of Atlanta burning and Gone with the Wind. And it just didn't happen. He had a great time when he went back there in 1879, and he stood around and said, hey, look at that house, look at that place. Why isn't my headquarters here? What's this talk about me burning the place to the ground? And keep in mind that Sherman is not going to make excuses. When he was accused of burning Columbia down, and he said, no, I didn't do it. When I got there, fires were going, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He said, I'll tell you one thing. If I'd have burned it, I'd tell you about it. I'm not going to make any excuses, but I had nothing to do with that in that particular case. So that's another roundabout answer to your question. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the press in fueling rumors and panic, and I understand that it was manipulated to bring this conversation.
Yeah, what happened, the press, the question was about the press's role in all of this. I did my first book on Sherman had to do with Sherman's Other War, the press, but I dealt with the Northern press. Northern press really didn't know what was going on. I mean, what Sherman did, he finally got his great wish. As you know, perhaps, Sherman hated reporters. With a passion, he hated reporters. So one of the greatest glees he had about the March to Sea was they didn't know what was going on, and they couldn't tell anybody. Now, what about the Southern press? Well, the Southern press published a lot of these rumors. Boy, Sherman's coming. You should see the horrible things he's doing, and these people are all barbarians, and heaven help us, you all better come together, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of the interesting things that the Southern press also publishes is a series of declarations from leading Confederate officials and officers saying, hey, Sherman's on the way, you better destroy everything in his path. Don't let him get those pigs and that corn and all the rest. Which is very interesting, because again, it puts us into the situation about a lot of destruction going on here, and Sherman's getting all the credit for it. And that's fine as far as he's concerned. Sherman had an incredible naivete. He really thought that once the war was over, everybody would say, hey, I had to do this. I was really a good guy. Look how nice I was to Southerners afterwards. And Ed's point may fit in, I think, very well. Yes, sir.
So how good of documentation is there of all the destruction, and what are the best estimates as far as the economic impact? Was it 5% of the wealth of Georgia, or 10%, or?
No, I have not. Now maybe somebody else knows. I just don't know. I've never seen anything. Sherman made some comments, and some other people have commented. Lee, do you know anything about it?
I mean, it seems
$100 million.
That's what. Yeah.
When you look at the swath the columns made for Georgia, I mean, they couldn't have covered more than 5 or 10% of the area of the whole state. I mean, I don't know that much about it, but
Yeah.
it wasn't really that destructive.
Oh, in the area that it took place, it was very destructive, but again, I would argue that the significance of Sherman's march to the sea was not the actual physical destruction as much as it was that psychological thing. I mean, this guy is everywhere. He's just not in this limited area. And if he's not there, he's going to be there soon.
Let me take two more questions. Okay.
John, one of the things that seemed to come to me as I read some of the individual soldier stories was they found all this great cornucopia of food and everything,
Right.
and none of this was getting to Andersonville, for example,
What are
or
the
other.
Yeah.
You know, they had this. I mean, not only did they not, you know, Joe Brown was the culprit, of course, and he wouldn't let any of this stuff not only not get to the Confederate Army, but he wouldn't let it get to Andersonville and wherever else. And so what was the big deal? I mean, all they had to do was to go another 50 miles away from where Sherman was, and all these people that were starving could get food again.
Yeah,
from their own people.
Yeah, Andersonville played a big role, not in Sherman's thinking so much, but in the common soldier. They came across some things dealing with prisoners of war, and not only with Andersonville, but some other places. It really was very upsetting to them. And I think too that the average soldier, you know, saw this. The average soldier in Sherman's army is no civil libertarian. But he also sees the slaves, and he sees what's going on. This is very upsetting. So Sherman doesn't have to do much convincing about all across the line. You're right. Last question.
Yes. My question has to do with what you're talking about, the common soldier. Now, I've thought a long time, how did Sherman move these 62,000 people? Well, Sherman didn't, okay? He didn't do that by himself. He couldn't control 62,000 people. He had his corps commanders, divisions, okay? Then you go on down. My question is, when you have this huge chain of command, how is it that this poor little guy down there in the trenches was able to relate to and revered so much this man? What did he do? How was it that his personality seeped down? In fact, I read somewhere that the army of the Tennessee was
Sherman's army, yeah. I'll tell you, that's a very good question, and I think that, you know, it's a question that military historians and the military deals with. You know, after World War II, there have been all kinds of studies, what makes people go into combat, and et cetera, et cetera. In Sherman's case, the thing about Sherman just always seemed to be around. I mean, the average soldier saw this guy. You know, and they'd see him, and he'd be out wearing this scruffy-looking uniform, sitting around a campfire. He'd stop, he'd violate his own orders. He'd stop and there'd be a picket. And he'd stop and he'd talk to this picket. Well, what have you seen? What do you think? Well, what do you think about the crops back in Ohio? The famous story of when they get to the Chattahoochee River under the Atlanta campaign. And this, you just picture this. There's Sherman, no clothes on, bathing himself in the Chattahoochee River with all his other soldiers. And there's a guy on a mule sitting next to him, talking to him while he's going through this kind of thing. Sherman had something, he had this kind of personality that made the average soldier believe that he was interested in them, that he was concerned about them, that he was one of them. He wasn't one of the stuck-up guys. He was right there suffering with them. And I think, too, they appreciated the fact that on the march to the sea, their lives are not being put on the line as they would be if they were in the trenches in Virginia or wherever it might be. And I think that had something to do. He just had a great concern for his soldiers, and they recognized this. And it filters through maybe more so because there's so many evidences of people seeing him. I'm reading diaries of common soldiers. They'd say something like, saw old Sherman or saw Uncle Billy the other day go riding by, and the boys yelled at him, and he lifted his hat and smiled. That'd be it. But suddenly they've got this connection with their commanding officer.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.